Montana Territory, 1870. The blizzard came without warning, slashing across the plains like God's own fury. 24-year-old Matthew Anderson pulled his collar higher as the temperature plummeted. The sky had darkened to a sickly yellow an hour before, and now the wind howled with a vengeance that made his Mustang nervous. "Easy, Thunder," he murmured, patting the horse's neck. "We will find shelter soon." The snow was falling fast now, erasing the horizon, obliterating the trail. Matthew had been riding for 3 days, moving cattle from his modest spread near Whitefish Creek to winter pasture. The other hands had headed back yesterday, but he had stayed to search for strays. Now he was paying the price for his thoroughness. His ranch was too far. The closest shelter would be the old Miller place about 2 miles east. Abandoned for years, it at least had walls and a roof. It would have to do. Matthew squinted against the needles of ice striking his face. The Rockies loomed like shadows to his west, but ahead there was nothing but swirling white. He had known this land his entire life, yet in this moment it felt alien and hostile. This was why a man kept to himself out here, he thought grimly. This was why Matthew Anderson had learned never to depend on anyone. The frontier was merciless to the weak, to those who needed others. 6 years ago, he had watched his father die after a cattle drive gone wrong. His mother had followed months later, her heart giving out from grief. Their ranch, built on dreams and promises, had nearly slipped away. Matthew had worked himself half to death to keep it, taking any job, any risk, and he had done it alone. The wind shifted suddenly, driving the snow horizontally across the landscape. Thunder snorted in protest, and Matthew leaned forward in the saddle. Just a little farther, he promised, though he wasn't entirely sure they were still on the right path. Then he saw it, a flicker of light through the curtain of snow. Too steady for lightning, too bright for a lantern, a fire and a substantial one at that. Matthew hesitated. The Miller place had been abandoned for years. Squatters, outlaws. Neither prospect appealed to him, but the alternative was freezing to death. He guided Thunder toward the light, feeling the weight of his Colt revolver against his hip. As he approached, the outline of the old cabin materialized from the blizzard. Smoke poured from the chimney, and light spilled from the single window. Matthew dismounted stiffly, his legs numb with cold. He led Thunder to the lean-to on the cabin's north side, providing what meager shelter he could for the animal. Then, gathering his courage, he approached the door. He knocked 3 times, hard enough to be heard over the storm. The door flew open so suddenly that Matthew stepped back, his hand instinctively moving toward his pistol. "Are you going to stand there letting all the heat out, or are you coming in?" demanded a woman's voice, sharp as the winter wind. Matthew blinked snowflakes from his eyelashes and found himself staring at a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, with startling green eyes and hair the color of wheat in summer, pulled back in a practical braid. She wore a simple blue dress beneath a woolen shawl, and her expression suggested that she found him about as welcome as the blizzard itself. "Ma'am," Matthew managed, touching the brim of his hat, "I was caught in the storm." "I thought the Miller place was abandoned." "It was," she replied, stepping back slightly. "Now it is not. Come in before you freeze to death on my doorstep. It would be inconvenient to have a corpse to deal with in this weather." Matthew stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. The cabin was small but surprisingly well kept. A fire blazed in the hearth, and the scent of something savory hung in the air. Simple furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner with a patchwork quilt, spoke of recent habitation. "Thank you," he said, removing his hat. "I am Matthew Anderson. I have a small spread south of here." "Gabriella O'Connor," she responded without warmth, closing the door against the howling wind. "Take off that wet coat and hang it by the fire." As Matthew complied, he studied his reluctant hostess. She moved with purpose, returning to a pot that bubbled over the flames. There was something guarded in her posture, as if she expected trouble from him. Her face, he noticed now, was strikingly beautiful, with high cheekbones and a determined chin, but it was set in lines too hard for someone so young. "How long have you been living here?" he asked, trying to make conversation as he warmed his hands by the fire. "Long enough." She stirred whatever was cooking, not looking at him. "The storm will last through the night. You can sleep by the fire." "I expect you to be gone by morning." Matthew raised an eyebrow at her curtness. "I mean no trouble, Miss O'Connor." "Everyone means trouble in one way or another, Mr. Anderson." She ladled some stew into a wooden bowl and thrust it at him, along with a spoon. "Eat, then keep quiet. I have no interest in conversation." Matthew accepted the food gratefully. The stew was hearty venison with wild onions and the last of summer's vegetables. As he ate, he noticed small details about the cabin: a stack of books on the table, herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, a rifle propped in the corner that looked well used. "This is good," he said between bites. "Thank you." Gabriella merely nodded, serving herself a smaller portion before sitting across from him at the table. She ate methodically, her eyes rarely leaving him, as if she expected him to reveal some hidden malice at any moment. "Your horse," she said suddenly, "did you stable him properly?" "As best I could in the lean-to," Matthew answered. "Thunder is hardy, but this storm is fierce." Gabriella frowned. "There is room in the shed out back. It is more secure." "When you finish eating, move him there. There is hay stored inside." "That is kind of you." "It is not kindness," she corrected sharply. "I simply have no wish to hear your lamentations if your horse dies overnight." Matthew suppressed a smile. This woman had more thorns than a cactus patch, but beneath the prickly exterior he sensed something else. Not gentleness exactly, but a fierce, practical compassion that she seemed determined to disguise. When they had finished eating, Matthew bundled up again and ventured into the storm to relocate Thunder. The small shed behind the cabin was indeed more substantial than the lean-to, with solid walls and a supply of hay. As he unsaddled the horse, he wondered about the woman inside. What was her story? What had brought her to this isolated cabin, alone in the Montana wilderness? By the time Matthew returned, snow crusted on his coat and hat, Gabriella had cleared away the supper things and was sitting near the fire, mending what appeared to be a man's shirt. "Your husband's?" Matthew asked, gesturing to the garment as he hung his coat to dry again. Gabriella's fingers stilled. "I have no husband, Mr. Anderson. I find men to be generally disappointing creatures. These are to sell in town when I next make the journey." "Forgive my assumption," Matthew said, settling on the floor near the hearth. "It is unusual to find a woman alone in these parts." "Perhaps it should not be." Her needle moved swiftly through the fabric. "Women are perfectly capable of surviving without men to complicate matters." "I did not suggest otherwise," Matthew replied, watching the firelight play across her features. "But the frontier is harsh." "Life is harsh everywhere, Mr. Anderson." She looked up at him, those green eyes reflecting the flames. "Some places are merely more honest about it." There was a story there, Matthew thought, a wound not yet healed. But it was not his business to pry, and she had made it clear she did not welcome questions. "Get some rest," Gabriella said, returning to her mending. "Your bedroll can go there by the fire." "I am a light sleeper and an excellent shot, so I would advise against any foolishness during the night." Matthew could not help but chuckle at that. "I assure you, Miss O'Connor, my intentions are entirely honorable. I am simply grateful not to be freezing to death in a snowbank." For a moment something that might have been amusement flickered across her face, quickly suppressed. "See that they remain honorable, Cowboy. Now sleep." "I want silence." Matthew retrieved his bedroll from his saddlebags and made himself as comfortable as possible on the hard floor. Outside, the wind continued to howl, rattling the cabin's shutters. But inside was warmth, shelter, and the enigmatic presence of Gabriella O'Connor, whose eyes held secrets as deep as the winter snow. As he drifted toward sleep, Matthew found himself wondering what had happened to make her heart as cold as the storm outside. And why, despite her frosty demeanor, he felt oddly drawn to this solitary woman who seemed to want nothing to do with him or any other man. Morning came with blinding brightness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine world of white. Matthew woke to find Gabriella already up, stoking the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal porridge. "Storm's broken," she said by way of greeting. "You can be on your way after you eat." Matthew sat up, running a hand through his tousled brown hair. "Good morning to you too, Miss O'Connor." She shot him a look that might have withered a lesser man, but Matthew merely smiled. There was something about her prickliness that he found strangely endearing, like a wild creature that hissed and spat to hide its fear. "Your horse survived the night," she informed him, ladling porridge into a bowl. "He will be ready to carry you far away from here." "You seem mighty eager to be rid of me," Matthew observed, accepting the breakfast. "Did I snore?" "You talked in your sleep," Gabriella replied, sitting with her own portion. "Something about cattle and wolves." Matthew's smile faded. The dream was a recurring one: wolves descending on his father's herd, his father racing to save a calf, the fall from his horse, the trampling. Matthew always woke before the end, but the real memory finished the story. His father's broken body, the long, painful journey home, the slow death that followed. Bad memories, he said simply. Gabriella studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. We all have those. It was as close to a personal revelation as she had come, and Matthew sensed it was as much as she would offer. They ate in silence after that, watching sunlight strengthen through the cabin's single window. After breakfast, Matthew helped clean up, then gathered his things. At the door, he hesitated. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss O'Connor. You saved my life last night." She shrugged, arms crossed defensively. "The debt is paid. You chopped extra wood before breakfast. We are even." Matthew nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. "This is the location of my ranch. If you ever need anything, supplies, help with repairs, someone to talk to, you know where to find me." Gabriella did not reach for the paper. "I do not need your help, Mr. Anderson." "Everyone needs someone sometimes," Matthew said quietly, setting the paper on the table, "even if just to share the silence with." Something shifted in her eyes, not softening exactly, but a momentary crack in her armor. Then it was gone, sealed over as quickly as it had appeared. "Goodbye, Mr. Anderson," she said, opening the door. The morning air rushed in, cold and clean. Matthew settled his hat on his head. "Until next time, Miss O'Connor." "There will not be a next time," she stated firmly. Matthew only smiled as he stepped out into the snow. "We will see." As he rode away, he glanced back once. She stood in the doorway, a solitary figure against the white landscape, watching him go. Matthew Anderson had always believed that the frontier was no place for connections, that independence was the only way to survive the harsh realities of the West. But something about Gabriella O'Connor's fierce solitude troubled him, like looking into a mirror and not entirely liking what he saw reflected there. He turned thunder toward home, but the thought of the woman in the cabin lingered long after the building had disappeared from view. 3 weeks passed before Matthew saw Gabriella again. Winter had settled over the territory with a vengeance, making travel difficult and ranch work doubly hard. He had almost convinced himself to forget the green-eyed woman with her walls of ice, focusing instead on the 1,000 tasks required to keep his cattle alive through the brutal season. But then came the day in Whitefish Creek, the nearest town to his ranch. Matthew had gone in for supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, and to mail letters to cattle buyers in Helena. He was loading his purchases into Thunder's saddlebags when he spotted her outside the general store, arguing with a man whose expensive coat and polished boots marked him as an Easterner. "The price is fair and you know it," Gabriella was saying, her voice carrying across the muddy street. She held a bundle of finely sewn shirts, the same work Matthew had seen her doing the night of the storm. $8 for the lot, not a penny more," the man replied with the condescending air of someone used to getting his way. "They are rough work at best." Matthew watched Gabriella's spine stiffen. 15. "Each one took 3 days of work, and the material alone cost me $4. The man laughed, the sound ugly and dismissive. "Perhaps you should find a husband to support you then. A woman alone cannot expect to drive hard bargains." Matthew found himself moving before he had made a conscious decision to intervene. "Is there a problem here?" Gabriella's eyes widened slightly when she saw him, then narrowed in what might have been annoyance. "This is not your concern, Mr. Anderson." "Any trouble to a neighbor is my concern," Matthew replied mildly, then turned to the stranger. "Those shirts are worth every penny she's asking. My men would be glad to pay it. Skilled needlework is hard to come by out here." The man looked Matthew up and down, taking in the weathered hat, the worn but well-maintained coat, the gun at his hip that showed signs of regular use. "You know this woman?" he asked, his tone suggesting something unsavory. "Miss O'Connor is a respected member of this community," Matthew said, his voice hardening slightly. "And she names fair prices for quality work." The man hesitated, weighing his options. Matthew wasn't an imposing figure, lean rather than bulky, of average height, but there was something in his steady gaze that suggested crossing him would be unwise. "Fine," the stranger muttered at last, pulling out his wallet. $15, highway robbery if you ask me." "No one asked you," Gabriella said coolly, taking the money and handing over the shirts. The man stalked off, muttering about the uncivilized territories. When he was gone, Gabriella turned to Matthew. "I did not need your help." "I never suggested you did," he replied. "But sometimes it is useful to have another voice backing your position. Even the most capable person can benefit from an ally." She studied him for a moment, suspicion warring with something else in her expression. Finally, she sighed. Thank you, though I maintain I could have handled it myself. I have no doubt, Matthew said with a small smile. Are you headed back to your cabin now? After I finish my errands, Gabriella replied, tucking the money into a small purse hanging from her belt. Matthew noticed she wore practical clothing for the journey to town, a split riding skirt, sturdy boots, and a heavy coat. Her wheat blonde hair was braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. May I buy you a meal before you head back? He asked, gesturing toward the small cafe across the street. As neighbors. Gabriella hesitated, and for a moment Matthew thought she would refuse. Then she gave a curt nod. Very well, but only because it would be foolish to turn down a free meal in winter. The cafe was warm and smelled of fresh bread and coffee. They settled at a small table by the window, removing their hats and coats. A plump waitress approached with a smile. Matthew Anderson, as I live and breathe, we have not seen you in town for weeks. She turned curious eyes to Gabriella. And who might this be? Mrs. Porter, this is Miss Gabriella O'Connor. She has the old Miller place east of town. Mrs. Porter's eyebrows rose. Is that so? We have heard rumors of someone taking up residence there, but you have kept to yourself, have you not, dear? I prefer solitude, Gabriella said stiffly. Well, you have picked the right territory for it, Mrs. Porter replied cheerfully. Now, what can I get you both? We have beef stew today, fresh this morning. They ordered, and when Mrs. Porter bustled away, an awkward silence fell. Matthew studied Gabriella in the better light of the cafe. Away from the cabin, dressed for town, she looked younger, though no less guarded. There were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of hard work and little rest. How are you managing out there? He asked. Winter can be brutal on that side of the creek. I manage fine, she replied, then seemed to reconsider her brusqueness. The cabin needed work when I arrived in September. The roof leaked and the chimney was partially collapsed, but I have made it weathertight. That is impressive work for one person, Matthew observed. Have you always been skilled with repairs? A shadow passed over her face. My father was a carpenter, I learned by watching him. Matthew caught the past tense. Gabriella's expression closed like a door slamming shut. He died 4 years ago. I am sorry, Matthew said quietly. I lost my parents 6 years back. It is a hard thing. Some of the tension left her shoulders at his words. Yes. It is. Their food arrived, steaming and fragrant. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Matthew spoke again. My offer stands, you know. If you need help with anything at the cabin, you need only ask. Gabriella looked up from her stew. Why what? Why would you help me? What do you want in return? The bluntness of her question was matched by the suspicion in her eyes. Matthew considered his answer carefully, because out here people help each other. It is how we all survive, he paused, and because I like you, Miss O'Connor, thorns and all. Color rose in her cheeks, but her expression remained skeptical. You do not know me well enough to like or dislike me, Mr. Anderson. I know you're brave enough to face a Montana winter alone. I know you do fine work with a needle and stand your ground when treated unfairly. I know you took in a stranger during a blizzard, despite your clear preference for solitude. Matthew smiled slightly. Those seem like worthy qualities to me. Gabriella looked away, uncomfortable with his assessment. You make too much of simple survival instincts. Perhaps, Matthew conceded. But I would still like to help if you will allow it. She was silent for a long moment, pushing the last of her stew around the bowl. The well pump freezes in this weather, she said finally, her voice so low he had to lean forward to hear it. I have been melting snow for water. It is tiresome. It was such a small admission, yet Matthew sensed it had cost her greatly. I can fix that, he said simply. When would be a good time to come by? Gabriella looked up, studying him as if searching for hidden motives. Whatever she saw in his face must have reassured her, for she nodded slightly. Tomorrow, afternoon. I will be there, Matthew promised. They finished their meal, and Matthew insisted on paying despite Gabriella's protests. Outside, the winter sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snowy street. You should start back soon, Matthew observed, looking at the gathering clouds to the west. The weather looks to be turning again. Gabriella nodded, pulling on her gloves. My horse is at the livery. She hesitated, then added stiffly, Thank you for the meal. It was my pleasure, Matthew replied. I will see you tomorrow. As he watched her walk away, back straight and head high, Matthew realized he was looking forward to tomorrow more than he had anticipated anything in a long time. It was an unsettling thought for a man who had grown accustomed to solitude. The next day, Matthew arrived at the Miller place, Gabriella's place now, shortly after noon. He had brought tools, a length of leather for the pump seal, and a small gift. Coffee beans from his own supply, finer than the usual frontier stock. It was an impulsive addition, and as he approached the cabin, he wondered if she would see it as presumptuous. Gabriella answered his knock promptly, dressed in practical work clothes, trousers rather than a skirt, though she wore a woman's blouse beneath a heavy woolen vest. Her hair was braided simply down her back. She looked younger this way, less severe, though wariness still shadowed her eyes. "You came," she said, as if she had half expected him not to. "I gave my word," Matthew replied simply. He held up the sack of tools. "Where is the well pump?" She led him around to the back of the cabin, where a hand pump stood over a stone-lined well. True to her word, it was frozen solid, ice forming a gleaming sheath over the metal. "I tried pouring hot water over it," Gabriella explained, "but it freezes again within hours." Matthew nodded, setting down his tools. "The seal is likely cracked, letting water into the mechanism where it shouldn't be. I brought leather to replace it." He removed his coat despite the cold and rolled up his sleeves. "This will not take long." Gabriella watched as he worked, her arms crossed against the chill. "Where did you learn such skills?" "The same place as you, I expect, necessity." Matthew grunted as he loosened a stubborn bolt. "When my father died, the ranch was falling apart. I could not afford to hire help, so I taught myself what needed doing." "You were young," she observed. 18, he confirmed. "Young enough to be scared, old enough to have no choice but to carry on." Gabriella was quiet for a moment. "I was 16 when my father died. We were in St. Louis then." Matthew glanced up at her, surprised by the voluntary information. "A long way from Montana territory." "Yes," her expression grew distant. "After he died, I had few options. I worked as a seamstress, then as a companion to an elderly woman. When she died last year, she left me enough money to start over somewhere new." A bitter smile touched her lips. "Somewhere I would not be at the mercy of others." Matthew returned his attention to the pump, sensing she had already shared more than she had intended. A brave decision, coming out here alone. "Not brave," Gabriella corrected. "Necessary." They fell silent as Matthew continued working. The pump had indeed suffered from a cracked seal, allowing water to seep into places it shouldn't. He worked methodically, replacing the leather, greasing the moving parts, and carefully reassembling the mechanism. "Try it now," he said finally, stepping back. Gabriella approached and worked the handle. After a few pumps, water gushed forth clear and cold. "You did it," she said, genuine appreciation warming her voice. "It was a simple repair," Matthew replied, wiping his hands on a cloth. "But it will need attention again before spring. The leather I used is good, but the cold is hard on it." He hesitated. "I could check it again in a few weeks if you like." Gabriella studied him, that now familiar wariness returning to her eyes. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Anderson, truly?" Matthew considered his answer carefully. "Because I know what it is to face the frontier alone, Miss O'Connor. It is a hard life, even for those of us who choose it." He met her gaze directly. "And because I would like to know you better." Color rose in her cheeks, but she did not look away. "I am not looking for the things most women want, Mr. Anderson. I have no interest in marriage or being anyone's responsibility." "I am not offering either," Matthew said quietly. "Only friendship, perhaps more someday if you wished it, but on your terms, not mine." Surprise flickered across her face, as if such a proposition was entirely foreign to her experience. "Men do not usually respect a woman's terms," she said finally, her voice low. "Then you have known the wrong kind of men," Matthew replied. Gabriella looked away, her expression troubled. "You may check the pump in 2 weeks," she said at last. "I cannot promise more than that." "I ask for no promises," Matthew assured her. He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out the small package of coffee. "I brought this for you. It is from my own supply, better than what they sell at the general store." Gabriella accepted the gift with hesitation. "Thank you," she said, the words coming awkwardly, as if she were unaccustomed to expressing gratitude. "Would you? Would you like some before you go? It is the least I can offer for your help." Matthew smiled, pleasantly surprised by the invitation. "I would like that very much." Inside the cabin, Matthew noticed small changes since his last visit. A bookshelf now stood against one wall, filled with well-worn volumes. A colorful quilt brightened the bed, and herbs hung in neat bundles from the ceiling beams. Gabriella had made this place her own in the weeks since he had last seen it. She busied herself with the coffee, grinding the beans and setting water to boil. Matthew sat at the small table, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "You have made improvements," he observed, looking around. Gabriella glanced up from her work. "It helps pass the winter evenings. There is little else to do when darkness falls at 4 in the afternoon." "Do you not get lonely out here?" Matthew asked, then immediately regretted the question when her shoulders stiffened. "No," she said shortly, "I prefer solitude to unwelcome company." "Fair enough," Matthew conceded, "though I hope my company falls into the former category rather than the latter." She did not answer immediately, focusing on measuring coffee into the pot. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its edge. "You are not unwelcome, Mr. Anderson. Unexpected perhaps, but not unwelcome." Coming from Gabriella, it felt like high praise indeed. Matthew hid a smile as she placed a steaming cup before him. The coffee was rich and fragrant, a luxury in the wilderness. They sipped in companionable silence for a few minutes, the tension between them easing slightly. "Tell me about your ranch," Gabriella said suddenly. "How large is it?" "Not as large as I would like," Matthew admitted. 160 acres, with grazing rights to another 200 of open range. I run about 200 head of cattle, though I lose some each winter. "And you manage this alone?" "I have 2 hands who help during the busy seasons, spring calving, summer grazing, fall roundup. But they have their own homesteads to tend in winter." Matthew shrugged. "I make do." "Like everyone out here," Gabriella observed. "Like everyone," Matthew agreed. "What are your plans for the spring? Will you plant crops?" Gabriella nodded. "A vegetable garden at least, perhaps some wheat if I can clear enough land." She looked down at her coffee. "I am still learning what can grow in this soil." "It is good land," Matthew told her, "fertile if you can keep the water on it. I could help with the plowing when the time comes." She looked up sharply. "I cannot pay you." "I am not asking for payment," Matthew said gently. "Neighbors help each other out here. That is how it works." "And what would you expect in return?" Suspicion edged her voice again. Matthew sighed. "Nothing you are not willing to give, Gabriella. Perhaps a meal now and then, company on occasion." "Nothing more." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher some hidden message in his words. "Very well," she said finally. "When spring comes, I will accept your help with the plowing." It was a small victory, but Matthew felt it keenly. He finished his coffee and rose to leave, aware that he had already stayed longer than she might be comfortable with. "I should get back," he said, reaching for his hat. "The cattle need checking before dark." Gabriella nodded, walking with him to the door. At the threshold, she hesitated. "Thank you for fixing the pump," she said, "and for the coffee." "It was my pleasure," Matthew replied. "I will return in 2 weeks to check on it if that suits you." "Yes," she said, and then with the ghost of a smile, "I will expect you." As Matthew rode away, he found himself already counting the days until he would see her again. It was a dangerous feeling for a man who had learned to expect nothing and depend on no one. But something about Gabriella O'Connor had gotten under his skin, her fierce independence that mirrored his own, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide, the mystery of what had made her flee to this remote corner of the territory. Matthew had always believed that the frontier was no place for entanglements, but as thunder carried him homeward through the winter landscape, he wondered if perhaps he had been wrong all along. 2 weeks stretched into 2 months. February brought bitter cold and deep snows, but Matthew faithfully made the journey to Gabriella's cabin every other week. Each visit lasted a little longer than the one before. Gabriella's initial wariness gradually gave way to a cautious acceptance of his presence, though she remained guarded about her past. He found excuses to help, repairing a loose shutter, patching a leak in the roof, bringing supplies from town when the snow made travel difficult for her. In return, she offered meals and conversation that grew less stilted with each encounter. She never asked him to leave earlier than necessary, which Matthew took as a promising sign. By early March, when the first hints of spring were teasing the frozen landscape, Matthew had learned fragments of Gabriella's story. Her father had been a respected carpenter in St. Louis, widowed when Gabriella was just a child. They had lived modestly but comfortably until his death from pneumonia when she was 16. With no other family, Gabriella had been forced to make difficult choices to survive. What those choices were, she would not say, but Matthew sensed they had left deep scars. She spoke of her years in St. Louis with bitter contempt, referring to it as a gilded cage where men make all the rules. Whatever had happened there had driven her to seek complete independence in the wilderness, far from society and its expectations. On a mild day in mid-March, Matthew arrived at the cabin to find Gabriella already outside, clearing space for what would become her garden. She wore trousers and a man's shirt with the sleeves rolled up, her hair secured in a practical braid. She straightened when she saw him approach, brushing dirt from her hands. "You are early," she observed, though there was no censure in her tone. "The creek is starting to thaw," Matthew replied, dismounting. "I thought you might want to discuss where to plant your crops before the ground softens completely." Gabriella nodded, gesturing to the area she had been clearing. "I was thinking here for vegetables. It gets good sun most of the day. But I know nothing about what grows best in this soil." "It is good land," Matthew assured her, walking the perimeter of the space she indicated. "Potatoes will do well, along with beans, carrots, and peas. Corn too, though our growing season is short." They spent the next hour planning the garden, with Matthew drawing a rough map in the dirt. Gabriella listened attentively, asking questions that revealed her inexperience with farming but also her quick intelligence. When they had finished, she invited him inside for coffee, now a customary part of his visits. The cabin was warm from the fire, and something savory simmered in a pot over the flames. Matthew removed his hat and coat, settling into what had become his usual chair at the table. Gabriella poured coffee for them both, then returned to a half-finished shirt she had been sewing. "I have been meaning to ask," Matthew said, warming his hands around the mug, "how did you find this place? The Miller cabin was abandoned for years before you arrived." Gabriella's needle paused briefly. "The land agent in Helena told me about it. The Millers left no heirs and the county had claimed the property for back taxes. I was able to purchase it for very little." A small smile touched her lips. "No one else wanted it, apparently. Too remote, too run down." "It suits you," Matthew observed. "You have made it your own." "Yes," she agreed, her voice softening slightly. "For the first time in my life, I have a place that belongs entirely to me. No one can take it away." There was a story behind those words, Matthew thought, but he knew better than to press. Instead, he sipped his coffee and changed the subject. "I brought seed potatoes in my saddlebag," he told her. "And some bean seeds. They will need to wait a few more weeks, but you will have them ready when the time comes." Surprise flickered across Gabriella's face. "You thought of that?" "Of course," Matthew replied simply. "You mentioned wanting to plant crops. Every farmer needs seeds." She was silent for a moment, her fingers stilling on her work. "Thank you," she said finally, the words coming more easily than they once had. "That was thoughtful." "You are welcome," Matthew said, then hesitated before adding, "There is a social gathering in town next Saturday, a dance to welcome spring, I thought. Perhaps you might like to attend." "With me?" Gabriella's expression closed immediately. "No," she said flatly, "I have no interest in such things." "It would be a chance to meet your neighbors," Matthew persisted gently. "People you might need to rely on someday." "I rely on no one," Gabriella said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "And I have no desire to be the subject of town gossip, which is all such events produce." Matthew watched her, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands had clenched around her sewing. "Not everyone is like the people you knew in St. Louis, Gabriella." Her eyes flew to his, startled by his use of her given name. "You know nothing of what I experienced there." "No," he agreed quietly. "Because you will not tell me, but I can see it haunts you still." Gabriella stood abruptly, moving to the fireplace to stir the pot that bubbled there. Her back was to him when she spoke again. "There was a man," she said, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it. "A wealthy man, a friend of my father's employer. After my father died, he offered me protection. I was 16, alone with nowhere to go." She let out a bitter laugh. "I did not understand what kind of protection he meant until it was too late." Matthew remained silent, sensing she needed to tell the story in her own way. "He set me up in a small apartment, told everyone I was his ward. But the things he wanted," she shook her head, still not looking at Matthew. "I endured it for almost a year, then I ran away. I found work as a seamstress, lived in a boarding house for working women. But he found me," her shoulders straightened. "I will not speak of what happened then, but afterward I knew I had to leave St. Louis entirely." So you went to work for the elderly woman, Matthew said softly. Gabriella nodded. Mrs. Fitzhugh, she had advertised for a companion in a newspaper. She lived in Kansas City, far enough away that I felt safe. She turned to face him, her expression challenging. Now you know why I have no interest in the attentions of men or in being the subject of town gossip. I have experienced enough of both to last a lifetime. Matthew held her gaze steadily. I am sorry for what happened to you, Gabriella. No one should have to endure such treatment. She studied his face as if searching for pity or judgment. Finding neither, some of the tension left her body. It was a long time ago, she said, though they both knew it wasn't, not really. I have made a new life here, one where I answer to no one but myself. And I would never ask you to do otherwise, Matthew told her. My invitation to the dance was just that, an invitation, not an expectation. You are free to refuse. Gabriella returned to her seat, picking up her sewing again. Then I refuse, she said, but without the earlier sharpness. I am not ready for that kind of scrutiny. I understand, Matthew said, and he did. But he also understood something else, that Gabriella's isolation was as much a prison as the apartment in St. Louis had been, just one of her own making. Freedom meant having choices, not simply exchanging one form of confinement for another, but that was a realization she would have to come to on her own. Matthew would not push where she was not ready to be led. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, and when it was time for Matthew to leave, Gabriella walked him to the door as had become their custom. I will come next week to check on the pump again, he said, settling his hat on his head. And to bring more seeds if I can find them. Gabriella nodded. I will expect you. She hesitated, then added, thank you for understanding about the dance. Matthew smiled gently. There will be other dances, Gabriella. When you are ready. As he rode away, Matthew thought about her revelation. It explained so much, her wariness, her fierce independence, her determination to need no one. But it also made clear the depth of trust she had shown in telling him, even that small part of her story. It was a beginning, fragile as spring ice, but just as full of promise. April brought mud and the first tender shoots of green breaking through the winter-hardened earth. As promised, Matthew helped Gabriella plow her garden plot, bringing his own team of horses for the task. Together they worked the soil, planted the seeds he had provided, and fenced the area to keep out rabbits and deer. The physical labor seemed to ease something in Gabriella. Working side by side in the warming spring air, she spoke more freely than she had before, sharing small stories from her childhood and asking questions about his. Matthew told her of growing up on the ranch, of his father's dreams for expanding their holdings, of his mother's quiet strength that had held the family together through lean times. You loved them very much, Gabriella observed as they took a break, sitting on the newly built fence with cups of water. Yes, Matthew agreed. They were good people, hardworking, honest. They taught me the value of both. You must miss them still. Matthew nodded, looking out over the greening landscape. Every day, but less painfully now than before. Time does that, I suppose. Gabriella was quiet for a moment. I miss my father that way, like an old wound that aches when the weather changes but no longer bleeds. It was the most poetic thing Matthew had ever heard her say, and he glanced at her in surprise. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. We should finish the fencing before dark, she said, changing the subject as she often did when conversation veered too close to personal matters. By the time they completed the work, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the newly planted garden. Matthew's shirt clung to his back with sweat, and even Gabriella looked pleasantly exhausted. Will you stay for supper? She asked as they gathered the tools. I have rabbit stew, more than enough for two. I would like that, Matthew replied, pleased by the invitation. Usually, he was the one to extend such overtures, not her. Inside, they washed away the day's dirt at the basin, taking turns with the water and towel. The domesticity of the moment struck Matthew suddenly, how natural it felt to be here with her, sharing the simple rituals of daily life. It was a dangerous thought, one that suggested hopes he had no right to harbor. Gabriella seemed unaware of his momentary distraction as she served the stew and cut thick slices of bread to accompany it. They ate hungrily, the day's work having built a hearty appetite. This is good, Matthew said, sopping up gravy with a piece of bread. You are a fine cook. Simple food is easy enough to prepare, Gabriella replied, though she looked pleased by the compliment. Mrs. Fitzhugh insisted I learn proper cooking. She said a woman who could not feed herself properly would always be at the mercy of others. A wise woman, Matthew observed. Yes, Gabriella agreed. She taught me many things: how to manage accounts, how to negotiate with tradesmen, how to recognize when someone is trying to cheat you. A small smile touched her lips. She was formidable, even in her 80s. Men who thought to take advantage of an elderly widow quickly learned their mistake. She sounds like someone I would have liked to know, Matthew said. I think she would have approved of you, Gabriella said, then looked startled by her own words as if she had revealed more than she intended. Matthew smiled but chose not to comment, not wanting to make her more uncomfortable. Instead, he helped clear the table when they had finished eating, then reluctantly prepared to leave. It will be dark soon, he said, reaching for his coat. I should head back. Gabriella walked with him to the door where Thunder waited, hitched to the porch rail. The evening was cool but pleasant, with the scent of damp earth and growing things on the breeze. Thank you for your help today, Gabriella said. I could not have done it alone. You are welcome, Matthew replied. Though I suspect you would have found a way even without me, you are nothing if not determined. That drew a genuine laugh from her, a sound so rare that Matthew found himself staring. Her face transformed when she laughed, the habitual guardedness falling away to reveal a beauty that took his breath. What is it? She asked, noticing his expression. You should laugh more often, Matthew said simply. It suits you. Gabriella's smile faded but not entirely. Perhaps I will in time. The words hung between them, pregnant with possibilities. Matthew hesitated, then decided to risk a small step forward. The offer to accompany me to town still stands, you know, not for a dance if you are not comfortable with that, but perhaps just to the general store or the cafe. At your convenience. Gabriella did not immediately refuse, which itself felt like progress. I will think about it, she said finally. That is all I can promise. That is all I ask, Matthew assured her. He settled his hat on his head and mounted Thunder. I will come again next week if that is agreeable. The garden will need tending. Yes, Gabriella agreed, next week. As Matthew rode away, he found himself smiling. I will think about it was not a yes, but it was far from the immediate refusal she would have given even a month ago. Slow progress, but progress nonetheless. The garden flourished under their combined care. May brought steady rains and warm sunshine, and by June, the first vegetables were ready for harvest. Matthew continued his regular visits, always finding some useful task to justify his presence, though they both knew his reasons for coming went beyond neighborly assistance. Their conversations grew easier with time. Gabriella began to ask questions about his life, his work at the ranch, his hopes for the future. Matthew answered honestly, sharing both his successes and his struggles. In turn, she revealed more of herself, her love of books, her skill with not just a needle but also drawing, her quiet observations of the natural world around her cabin. What she did not do was accept his invitation to visit town. Each time Matthew gently raised the possibility, she found a reason to defer. Too much work in the garden, shirts to finish for a customer, whether that looked threatening. He did not press, understanding that for Gabriella, the cabin represented safety. Venturing beyond its boundaries would require a courage different from the kind that had brought her to Montana in the first place. June slipped into July. The summer heat brought new challenges, ensuring the garden had enough water, keeping the cabin cool during the day, watching for the wildfires that sometimes swept through the region during dry spells. Matthew found himself spending more time at Gabriella's place than his own, though his ranch duties kept him from visiting as often as he might have wished. On a sweltering afternoon in late July, Matthew arrived at the cabin to find Gabriella outside, hair tied back with a kerchief, digging a shallow trench from the creek to her garden. An irrigation ditch, she explained when he dismounted to help. The garden needs more water than the rain has provided lately. A good idea, Matthew agreed, taking the shovel from her hands despite her protest. But hard work in this heat. Together they completed the task, guiding a small stream of creek water to the thirsty plants. When they finished, both were sweating and dirt-streaked. There is fresh water in the creek bend for washing, Gabriella said, leading the way to a pool formed by a natural curve in the stream. I often come here on hot days. The water was cool and clear, shaded by cottonwood trees that whispered in the slight breeze. Matthew splashed his face and arms, washing away the worst of the dirt, while Gabriella did the same a modest distance away. This is a pleasant spot, Matthew observed, sitting on a flat rock by the water's edge. Peaceful. Gabriella nodded, wringing water from her kerchief before retying it around her hair. I come here to read sometimes when the cabin grows too warm. She settled beside him on the rock, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. It was the nearest she had ever willingly placed herself to him, and Matthew was acutely aware of her presence. The faint scent of lavender soap, the few strands of wheat blonde hair that had escaped her kerchief, the rhythm of her breathing. Matthew, she said suddenly, using his given name for the first time, may I ask you something? Of course, he replied, surprised by the unexpected intimacy. Gabriella stared at the flowing water, not meeting his eyes. Why do you continue to visit me? Truly, the garden is planted, the pump works well, the roof no longer leaks. Yet you still come every week without fail. It was a question Matthew had been expecting eventually, though he was not entirely prepared to answer it. Honesty seemed the only possible approach. Because I care for you, Gabriella, he said simply, more than I intended to, more than might be wise, but there it is. She was silent for a long moment, still watching the creek. Even knowing what you know about me, about my past. What happened to you does not define who you are, Matthew said quietly. I see a woman of extraordinary courage and determination. A woman who refuses to let the past dictate her future. How could I not admire that? Gabriella turned to look at him then, her green eyes searching his face. And if I told you I can never be what most men want in a woman? That I may never be comfortable with certain things. Matthew held her gaze steadily. Then I would say that what most men want is irrelevant to me. What matters is what you want, Gabriella. What makes you feel safe and respected? She drew a shaky breath. I do not know what I want, that is the truth of it. I came here to be independent, to need no one, and then you appeared in a blizzard and everything became complicated. Life often is, Matthew said with a small smile. Rarely does it follow the paths we lay out for it. No, Gabriella agreed, it rarely does. She hesitated, then slowly, deliberately, placed her hand over his where it rested on the rock. It was a small gesture, but for Gabriella, it represented an enormous step. Matthew remained perfectly still, allowing her to set the pace of this fragile new territory they were entering. I am not ready for more than this, she said softly. Not yet, perhaps not ever, you should know that. I do, Matthew assured her, and I ask for nothing more than what you freely choose to give. They sat in silence for a time, her hand resting lightly on his, the creek murmuring beside them. It was enough, Matthew thought, for now it was enough. The moment was broken by a distant rumble of thunder. They looked up to see dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. A storm is coming, Gabriella observed, withdrawing her hand. We should return to the cabin. They walked back together, close but not touching. The air had grown heavy with the promise of rain, and by the time they reached the cabin, the first large drops were beginning to fall. You should stay until it passes, Gabriella said, opening the door. Summer storms can be dangerous. Matthew nodded, leading Thunder to the shed before joining her inside. The rain came in earnest then, pounding on the roof and streaming down the windows. Lightning flashed, followed by the crash of thunder directly overhead. It will be a bad one, Gabriella observed, lighting a lamp against the sudden darkness. The first real storm of summer. She busied herself preparing coffee, while Matthew built up the fire against the chill that had come with the rain. The domesticity of the scene struck him again, how natural it felt to be here with her, sharing these simple tasks. But now, after their conversation by the creek, the moment carried new weight, new possibilities. When the coffee was ready, they sat at the table, listening to the storm rage outside. Gabriella seemed thoughtful, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. I have decided to go into town next week, she said abruptly. I need supplies that cannot wait until autumn. And I have shirts to deliver to customers. Matthew tried to hide his surprise at this sudden announcement. Would you like me to accompany you? Yes, Gabriella said, the word coming more easily than he would have expected. I would appreciate that. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Then I will come on Tuesday if that suits you. She nodded, still not meeting his eyes. Tuesday is fine. The storm continued for over an hour, rain giving way to hail that clattered against the roof like thrown pebbles. When it finally passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world and the fresh scent of rain-soaked earth, Matthew knew he should leave. It was already late afternoon and he had ranch duties waiting. I should go, he said reluctantly, rising from the table. Gabriella walked with him to the door as usual. There she hesitated, then surprised him completely by stepping forward and placing a brief light kiss on his cheek. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding." Before Matthew could respond, she had stepped back, her expression a mixture of uncertainty and determination. He touched his cheek where her lips had been, not bothering to hide his smile. Until Tuesday, Gabriella. As he rode away, the world seemed brighter somehow, despite the receding storm clouds. The small gestures, her hand on his, the kiss on his cheek, represented trust that had been hard-won and freely given. For a woman with Gabriella's past, they were acts of extraordinary courage. Matthew knew there would be more storms to weather, both literal and figurative. Gabriella's journey toward trust would not be a straight line. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, old fears resurfacing. But for the first time, he allowed himself to hope that they might find their way forward together. The summer storm had broken the heat wave, leaving behind cooler air and clear skies. On Tuesday morning, Matthew arrived at Gabriella's cabin to find her waiting on the porch, dressed in her best riding skirt and a fresh blouse. Her wheat blonde hair was neatly braided and pinned beneath a modest hat. A package wrapped in brown paper, the shirts for her customers, sat beside her. "Good morning," Matthew said, dismounting. "You look very fine today." Gabriella smoothed her skirt self-consciously. "It has been some time since I dressed for town." "I hope it is appropriate." "More than appropriate," Matthew assured her. "You will put every other woman in Whitefish Creek to shame." She gave him a skeptical look, but he caught the hint of pleasure in her eyes. "Let me get my horse," she said, moving toward the small corral behind the cabin. Matthew watched as she saddled her mare with practiced ease. For all her city upbringing, Gabriella had adapted well to frontier life. She rode astride rather than side saddle, practical as always, but with a natural grace that made the position seem elegant rather than unladylike. They set off together, the morning sun warming their backs. Gabriella was quiet at first, tension evident in the straight line of her spine and the tight grip she maintained on the reins. But as the miles passed uneventfully, she gradually relaxed, even commenting on the wildflowers that dotted the trail. "The Indian paintbrush is particularly vivid this year," she observed, "and there seems to be more of it than last summer." "The spring rains were good to them," Matthew agreed, pleased by her growing ease. "Wait until August when the asters bloom. The whole prairie turns purple and gold." Gabriella smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "I look forward to seeing that. Last August I was too busy making the cabin habitable to notice much beyond my own property." They rode at a leisurely pace, in no hurry to reach town. Matthew pointed out landmarks along the way, a rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear, a grove of aspens where deer could often be spotted at dawn, the distant peaks of mountains still capped with snow even in July. As they approached Whitefish Creek, however, Gabriella's tension returned. She straightened in the saddle, her expression closing like a book snapped shut. "We do not have to stay long," Matthew assured her, noting the change, "just long enough to conduct your business." Gabriella nodded, visibly steeling herself as the first buildings came into view. Whitefish Creek was hardly a metropolis, a single main street lined with wooden structures, a church with a modest steeple, a handful of houses scattered around the perimeter. But after months of isolation, even this small settlement might seem overwhelming. They tied their horses at the hitching post outside the general store. Matthew offered his arm as Gabriella dismounted, and to his surprise, she accepted it, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve as they entered the shop. The storekeeper, Mr. Jenkins, looked up from his ledger and broke into a wide smile when he saw Matthew. "Anderson, twice in 1 month must be a record." His eyes shifted to Gabriella with undisguised curiosity. "And Miss O'Connor, if I'm not mistaken." "We've heard much about you but seen little." Gabriella's grip on Matthew's arm tightened slightly. "Mr. Jenkins," she acknowledged with a nod, "I find I need to replenish my supplies." Of course," the storekeeper said jovially. "What can I get for you today?" Gabriella produced a list from her pocket, and Mr. Jenkins set about filling it, chattering all the while about town news, the weather, and the influx of new settlers expected in the fall. Matthew watched Gabriella carefully, ready to intervene if she showed signs of distress, but she handled the interaction with composed dignity. When her purchases were tallied and paid for, they moved on to the tailor's shop, where Gabriella delivered her package of shirts. The tailor, a thin man with spectacles, inspected her work with approving nods. "Fine stitching, Miss O'Connor, very fine indeed. I would be pleased to commission more from you if you are willing." I am, Gabriella replied, accepting payment for the completed work, though I may be busy with my garden through harvest time. Of course, the tailor said, whenever is convenient for you. Quality work like this is worth waiting for. By the time they had finished their errands, it was midday. Matthew suggested lunch at the cafe, half expecting Gabriella to refuse. To his surprise, she agreed, though he could see the effort it cost her. Mrs. Porter greeted them with the same enthusiastic curiosity she had shown during their previous visit. This time, however, she was not content with merely serving their food. So, Miss O'Connor, she said, refilling their coffee cups, how are you finding life on the old Miller place? It must be lonely out there all by yourself. Gabriella hesitated, and Matthew was about to intervene when she answered with calm composure. I find it peaceful rather than lonely, Mrs. Porter. And I have good neighbors when company is desired. Mrs. Porter's gaze flicked between them, speculation evident in her expression. Yes, I can see that you do, Mr. Anderson has always been known for his neighborly qualities. The comment carried insinuations that made Gabriella stiffen, but before she could respond, the cafe door opened, admitting a group of cowboys fresh from the trail. Mrs. Porter excused herself to attend to the new customers, leaving them in relative privacy. I apologize for that, Matthew said quietly. Small towns breed gossip like flies on sugar. It is no different from scent. Louis, in that regard, Gabriella replied, her voice tight. Only the scale changes, not the nature of people's interest in others' affairs. They finished their meal quickly after that, Gabriella clearly eager to leave before Mrs. Porter could return with more probing questions. Outside, however, they encountered a new challenge. Sheriff Thomas Davies was approaching, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he spotted Matthew. Anderson, just the man I wanted to see. The sheriff nodded politely to Gabriella. And this must be Miss O'Connor. Welcome to Whitefish Creek, ma'am, though you've been in our vicinity for some time now. Sheriff, Gabriella acknowledged with a stiff nod. What can I do for you, Sheriff? Matthew asked, hoping to keep the encounter brief for Gabriella's sake. Just wanted to give you a heads up, Davies said, lowering his voice slightly. There's been reports of cattle rustling over Blackwater Way. Nothing in your area yet, but it pays to be vigilant. 3 ranches hit in the last month. Matthew frowned. Any suspects? Nothing solid, Davies admitted. Tracks lead toward the territorial border, but that's a lot of ground to cover with limited men. He glanced at Gabriella. Begging your pardon for the grim talk, Miss O'Connor, but as you're living alone out there, you should be aware as well. Lock your doors at night and keep that rifle of yours handy. Gabriella's eyes widened slightly. How do you know I have a rifle? Davies smiled. Ma'am, in this territory, I'd be more surprised if you didn't. But Matthew here mentioned it when he was in town last week, said you were quite proficient with it too. She glanced at Matthew, who shrugged apologetically. The sheriff asked if you were well protected out there. I saw no reason to lie. Well, I'll let you folks get on with your day, Davies said, touching the brim of his hat. Just stay alert, both of you. Rustlers aren't known for their gentle manners when crossed. As the sheriff walked away, Gabriella turned to Matthew with a troubled expression. Do you think there is cause for concern? It never hurts to be cautious, Matthew replied, but Blackwater is a good 30 miles from here. If they are moving toward the territorial border, they're heading away from us, not toward. Gabriella nodded, but he could see the news had unsettled her. I think I am ready to return home now, she said quietly. They retrieved their horses and loaded Gabriella's purchases into her saddlebags. As they rode out of town, Matthew noticed she kept glancing back as if expecting pursuit. Are you all right? He asked when they were well beyond the town limits. Gabriella sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. Yes, no, I do not know. She looked at him with troubled eyes. I came here to escape the dangers of city life, only to find different dangers waiting in the wilderness. The frontier has its share of troubles, Matthew acknowledged, but in my experience they're more honest troubles at least. A rustler wants your cattle, not your soul. That drew a small smile from her, a philosophical cowboy who would have thought it. I contain multitudes, Matthew replied with a grin, quoting from one of the books he had seen on her shelf. Gabriella's smile widened, genuine this time. Walt Whitman, I am impressed, Mr. Anderson. My mother was a great reader, Matthew explained. She believed education shouldn't stop just because we lived far from any school. He glanced at her. Besides, I've had plenty of time to browse your bookshelf while waiting for coffee these past months. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the tension of the town visit gradually easing from Gabriella's posture. By the time they reached the turnoff to her cabin, she seemed almost relaxed again. "Thank you for accompanying me today," she said as they approached her home. "It was easier with you there." "I was happy to do it," Matthew replied. "And proud of how well you handled everything." Mrs. Porter's nosiness would try the patience of a saint. Gabriella laughed, the sound still rare enough to delight him. "She means well, I suppose, as do most people." "It is just hard to trust that," Matthew finished for her when she faltered. "I understand." They reached the cabin and Matthew helped her unload her purchases. The domestic routine they had established over the past months resumed naturally. Matthew building up the fire while Gabriella put away her supplies, then both of them settling at the table with coffee. "Will you stay for supper?" Gabriella asked, the invitation coming more easily than it once had. "I should check on the herd," Matthew said reluctantly. "The sheriff's warning about rustlers has me concerned, even if they are operating some distance away." Disappointment flickered across Gabriella's face before she masked it. "Of course, that is sensible." Matthew hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "But perhaps you would consider coming to the ranch for supper later this week. I am not much of a cook, but I can manage a decent steak. And I would like to show you the place." The invitation clearly surprised her. "Your ranch?" "Yes," Matthew said, "it's only fair after all, you've hosted me countless times. And I'd like you to see what I've built there." Gabriella was quiet for a moment, considering. "All right," she said finally, "if the weather holds I could come on Friday." Matthew smiled, pleased by her acceptance. "Friday it is then. I'll come collect you around 4 if that suits." "It does," Gabriella agreed, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I look forward to it." As Matthew rode home that evening, he reflected on the day's events. Gabriella's willingness to venture into town, her acceptance of his invitation to visit the ranch, these were significant steps for a woman who had walled herself off from the world. The trust implied by these actions touched him deeply. But the sheriff's warning about rustlers nagged at him. Matthew had seen what such men could do, not just stealing cattle but burning homesteads, attacking families who got in their way. Gabriella's isolation, which she had seen as protection, suddenly seemed like vulnerability. He resolved to increase his vigilance, to ride the boundaries of both their properties more frequently. Gabriella had come too far, risked too much, to have her hard-won peace threatened now. Matthew would do whatever was necessary to ensure her safety, even if she never asked it of him. Friday arrived clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of summer grass and wildflowers. Matthew spent the morning preparing for Gabriella's visit, cleaning the cabin that served as his home, preparing food, even cutting wildflowers to place in a jar on the table. It had been a long time since he had entertained a guest, especially one who mattered as much as she did. His ranch house was modest compared to some in the territory, a 2-room cabin built by his father, with a small lean-to addition Matthew had constructed himself. But it was solid and well-maintained, with a stone fireplace, proper windows with glass panes, and furniture his mother had insisted on bringing from their previous home in Missouri. It wasn't grand, but it was his, built and preserved through years of hard work. At 4 o'clock, Matthew arrived at Gabriella's cabin to find her waiting on the porch, dressed in a simple but pretty blue dress he had never seen before. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, held back from her face by a blue ribbon that matched her dress. "You look beautiful," he said, unable to hide his admiration. Gabriella touched her hair self-consciously. "Thank you." It seemed appropriate for a social visit. The term social visit made Matthew smile. It sounded so formal, yet he understood her need to define boundaries, to make clear the nature of their relationship. For Gabriella, such definitions provided safety. They rode side by side, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the landscape. As they crested a hill, Matthew's ranch came into view in the valley below, the main cabin, the barn, the corrals, and beyond them, the green expanse of pasture land where cattle grazed. "It's beautiful," Gabriella said, reining her horse to a stop beside his. "So green even in summer." "We're lucky to have the creek running through," Matthew explained. "It never completely dries up, even in drought years. The cattle always have water, and the grass stays greener longer than on some spreads." They continued down the hill, and as they approached, Gabriella took in the details of the place. the vegetable garden beside the cabin, smaller than hers but well tended. The flowers Matthew's mother had planted years ago that still bloomed along the front path, the rocking chair on the porch where his father had spent summer evenings. "This is a true home," she said softly. "Not just a house, but a home." Matthew glanced at her, surprised by the observation. "Yes, I suppose it is, though it's been lonely since my parents died." They dismounted, and Matthew showed her to the barn to unsaddle their horses. As they worked side by side, he was struck again by how naturally they moved together, each anticipating the other's actions, working in comfortable tandem. From the barn, he led her to the cabin, suddenly nervous about her reaction to his living quarters. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, a sofa his mother had brought from Missouri, and shelves filled with books and the few ornaments his family had collected over the years. "This is lovely," Gabriella said, turning slowly to take it all in. She moved to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. "Shakespeare, Dickens, Emerson, your mother had excellent taste." "She would have liked you," Matthew said without thinking. "She always said a woman who reads knows her own mind." Gabriella glanced at him, a soft smile playing at her lips. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was, Matthew agreed. Strong too. Frontier life wasn't easy for her, coming from a comfortable home in St. Louis, but she never complained. "She learned what needed doing and did it, just as you have." The comparison seemed to please Gabriella. She continued her exploration of the cabin, examining the patchwork quilt on the sofa, the charcoal sketches of the ranch Matthew had drawn on winter evenings, the collection of arrowheads his father had found over the years. "You have talent," she said, studying one of the sketches. "These are quite good." "Just a hobby," Matthew replied, though her praise warmed him. "Something to pass the time when snow keeps me indoors." They moved to the kitchen area, where Matthew had prepared for their meal, steaks ready to cook, potatoes waiting to be roasted in the coals, a pie he had purchased from Mrs. Porter in town. "May I help?" Gabriella asked, already reaching for an apron hanging by the stove. "If you like," Matthew replied, pleased by her offer, "though you're my guest." "You shouldn't have to work." Gabriella tied the apron around her waist. "I prefer being useful to sitting idle, and cooking together is pleasanter than cooking alone, don't you think?" The simple statement revealed more than perhaps she realized, that she had begun to value companionship, to see the possibility of a life not defined solely by independence. They worked together preparing the meal, moving around each other in the small kitchen space with surprising ease. Matthew tended the fire and grilled the steaks, while Gabriella prepared vegetables and set the table. It felt comfortable, domestic, a glimpse of what life could be like if they chose to build it together. As they sat down to eat, Matthew asked about her garden, and Gabriella spoke animatedly about the progress of her vegetables, the herbs she had planted, her plans for preserving the harvest for winter. It was the most he had ever heard her speak at one time, and he was content to listen, enjoying the spark of enthusiasm in her eyes. "I'm boring you with gardening talk," she said finally, noticing his smile. "Not at all," Matthew assured her. "I like seeing you passionate about something, it suits you." Gabriella blushed slightly, dropping her gaze to her plate. "I never expected to enjoy it so much. Growing things, I mean instant." Louis, our home, had only a small yard, and in Mrs. Fitzhugh's house, the gardeners took care of everything. "It gets in your blood," Matthew said, "the connection to the land. My father used to say that a person who grows their own food understands the value of patience better than anyone." "Your father sounds as wise as your mother," Gabriella observed. They were well matched, Matthew agreed. 25 years married, and I never heard them exchange a harsh word. Disagreements, yes, but never cruelty." He met her eyes across the table. "That's what I remember most, how they treated each other with respect, even when they didn't see eye to eye." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Gabriella held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, but not before he caught the faint smile that curved her lips. After dinner, Matthew suggested a walk to show her the rest of the ranch before sunset. They strolled together toward the creek that gave the nearby town its name, following its winding course through the pasture land where Matthew's cattle grazed. "How many head do you run now?" Gabriella asked, watching the animals with interest. "About 250, Matthew replied. "Not a large herd by some standards, but enough to be profitable if the winter isn't too harsh and the beef prices hold steady." They reached a bend in the creek, where a large cottonwood tree spread its branches over the water. The setting sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground with golden light. This was my favorite spot as a boy, Matthew told her, gesturing to a lower branch that stretched horizontally over the water. I would sit there for hours, fishing or just watching the water flow by. Gabriella smiled, looking up at the massive tree. Did you climb all the way to the top? Of course, Matthew laughed, much to my mother's dismay. She was convinced I would fall and break my neck. But you never did. Not from this tree, at least, Matthew admitted. A pine tree on the North Ridge gave me a nasty fall when I was 12, broke my arm and earned the lecture of a lifetime. Gabriella laughed, the sound mingling with the gurgle of the creek and the rustle of leaves overhead. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the water flow past. Thank you for showing me your home, Gabriella said finally. It helps me understand you better, I think. Seeing where you come from, what you've built here. I'm glad you came, Matthew replied. And I hope you'll come again. The ranch is at its best in autumn, when the cottonwoods turn gold and the hills take on that purple haze just before the first snow. Gabriella turned to face him, the setting sun illuminating her profile. I would like that, she said softly. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Matthew took a careful step closer, giving her time to retreat if she wished. When she didn't move away, he slowly, tentatively reached for her hand. Gabriella allowed the contact, her fingers curling around his with a trust that touched him deeply. Standing there beside the creek, hand in hand as the sun painted the world in gold and amber, Matthew felt a sense of rightness he had never experienced before. Gabriella, he began, his voice low. I want you to know that I... The crack of a rifle shot split the air, followed by the panicked bellowing of cattle. Matthew reacted instinctively, pulling Gabriella behind the tree for cover. What is it? She gasped, her face suddenly pale. Trouble, Matthew replied grimly. Stay here, don't move until I come back for you. Before she could protest, he was running toward the sound, drawing his revolver as he went. At the crest of the nearby hill, he dropped to his stomach, crawling the last few feet to peer over the ridge. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. 3 riders were cutting several head of cattle from his herd, driving them toward the east ridge. Rustlers, just as the sheriff had warned. Matthew took careful aim with his revolver, firing a warning shot over their heads. The rustlers scattered, 2 taking cover while the 3rd continued pushing the cattle. Another rifle shot rang out, the bullet striking the ground near Matthew's position. He rolled away, then ran in a crouch to a cluster of rocks that offered better protection. From this vantage, he could see the rustlers more clearly, rough-looking men, their faces obscured by bandanas. One was working his way around the flank, trying to get a clear shot at Matthew. Matthew fired again, forcing the man back. But he knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. His ranch hands were in town for supplies, and he had only his revolver against their rifles. Just as he was calculating his next move, another shot rang out from behind him where he had left Gabriella. His heart seized with fear, but then he saw one of the rustlers drop his rifle, clutching his arm. Matthew turned to see Gabriella approaching, rifle in hand, using the terrain for cover just as he was doing. I told you to stay hidden, he shouted as she reached his position. And leave you outnumbered, she retorted, taking aim again. I am an excellent shot, remember. As if to prove her point, she fired, the bullet striking near enough to another rustler that he scrambled backward, losing his hat in the process. The unexpected resistance seemed to give the rustlers pause. After a brief consultation, they abandoned the cattle they had been driving and retreated toward the ridge, firing occasional shots to cover their escape. When they had disappeared over the hill, Matthew turned to Gabriella, a mixture of admiration and concern in his expression. That was either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both, she admitted, the rifle still steady in her hands. But I could not stay hidden while you faced danger alone. Matthew shook his head, a reluctant smile forming. You are full of surprises, Gabriella O'Connor. They made their way cautiously to where the rustlers had been, finding nothing but hoofprints and the abandoned cattle, which had scattered in the confusion. One of the cows was bleeding from a bullet graze along its flank, but the wound was not serious. We should alert the sheriff, Gabriella said, helping Matthew herd the scattered cattle back toward the main group. First light tomorrow, Matthew agreed. It's too dangerous to ride to town tonight, they might still be in the area. The sun had set completely by the time they returned to the ranch house, darkness settling over the land. Matthew lit lamps and checked all the windows and doors, his rifle now close at hand. You should stay here tonight, he told Gabriella. It's not safe for you to ride back to your cabin until we're certain those men are gone. She nodded, practical enough to see the wisdom in his suggestion, despite any propriety concerns. I can sleep on the sofa. No, you'll take the bed, Matthew insisted. I'll take the sofa. I'll need to check on the herd periodically through the night anyway. Gabriella looked as if she might argue, then sighed. Very well. But wake me for the dawn check, I want to help. Her fierce determination made Matthew smile despite the seriousness of the situation. Deal. He found a nightshirt of his mother's that had remained in a chest all these years, offering it to Gabriella for the night. She accepted it with a grateful nod and disappeared into the bedroom to change. When she emerged, the too large nightshirt making her look younger and more vulnerable, Matthew felt a surge of protectiveness. The evening had not ended as he had planned, but the way Gabriella had stood beside him, brave and capable in the face of danger, had revealed something important about her character, and about his feelings for her. "Good night, Matthew," she said softly, pausing at the bedroom door. "Good night, Gabriella," he replied. "Sleep well, you're safe here." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, her expression softening. "I know," she said simply and closed the door. Matthew settled on the sofa, rifle within reach, his thoughts in turmoil. The rustlers were a serious concern, one that would require immediate attention. But even more pressing was the realization that had struck him as they stood together by the creek, just before the shots rang out. He was in love with Gabriella O'Connor. Not just attracted, not just intrigued, but deeply, irrevocably in love with her strength, her determination, her quiet courage. And he had almost told her so before the rustlers interrupted. Perhaps it was for the best, he thought as sleep finally claimed him. Such declarations should not be rushed, especially with someone as cautious as Gabriella. Time was on their side after all. Or so he believed, unaware of how quickly that time would run out. Dawn broke clear and cool, with dew silvering the grass outside the cabin. Matthew woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in the kitchen. He sat up to find Gabriella already dressed in yesterday's clothes, her hair neatly braided, tending to breakfast preparations. "You should have woken me," he said, rising from the sofa. "You needed the rest," she replied, not looking up from the stove, "and I am perfectly capable of making breakfast." Matthew smiled at her characteristic independence. "I never doubted it for a moment." While Gabriella finished cooking, Matthew washed and dressed, then stepped outside to check the immediate surroundings. There was no sign of the rustlers, and the cattle grazed peacefully in the morning light. But the events of the previous evening had left him uneasy. Those men would not give up so easily, not when cattle prices were high and unprotected herds presented tempting targets. Breakfast was a quiet affair, both of them preoccupied with thoughts of the danger that had intruded on their peaceful evening. When they had finished eating, Matthew outlined his plan. "I'll ride to town to alert the sheriff," he said. "You should return to your cabin and stay there until I come for you. Keep your rifle handy." Gabriella frowned. "I do not need an escort home, Matthew, and I certainly do not need to hide in my cabin while you face potential danger." "This isn't about your capabilities," Matthew said carefully. "Those men saw both of us yesterday. They know we can identify them. That makes us both targets." "All the more reason we should stay together," Gabriella argued. "Two rifles are better than one." Matthew sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. "All right, we'll go to town together, then I'll see you safely home before I return to patrol my boundaries." It was a compromise, and not one he was entirely comfortable with, but Gabriella nodded in acceptance. "Very well, but I expect to be kept informed. These rustlers threaten my home as much as yours." They rode to Whitefish Creek side by side, alert for any sign of the rustlers. The town was just coming to life when they arrived, shopkeepers opening their doors, the cafe smoke signaling breakfast preparations within. At the sheriff's office, they found Davies already at his desk, reviewing wanted posters. "Anderson, Miss O'Connor," he greeted them, rising from his chair. "Early visitors, what brings you to town at this hour?" Matthew explained about the rustlers, describing the men and their tactics as best he could. Davies listened grimly, making notes as Matthew spoke. "Same description as the Blackwater incidents," he confirmed when Matthew finished. "They're moving north just as I feared. Operating in a pattern, hit a ranch, then move on before we can organize a response." "What can be done?" Gabriella asked, her voice steady despite the concern in her eyes. Davies scratched his chin thoughtfully. I'll telegraph the marshal and Helena, request additional deputies. In the meantime, I'll organize a patrol from volunteers here in town. He looked at Matthew. Your ranch is isolated, Anderson. And Miss O'Connor's place even more so. Neither of you should be alone until we catch these men. I can take care of myself, Gabriella began, but Davies shook his head. No doubt you can, ma'am, but these aren't ordinary thieves. They've already killed one rancher over in Blackwater who tried to stop them, shot him in the back while he was defending his herd. The sheriff's expression was grave. I'd advise you to stay in town, both of you, until this is resolved. Matthew glanced at Gabriella, expecting resistance to this suggestion. To his surprise, she appeared to be considering it seriously. How long might that be, she asked. Hard to say, Davies admitted. Could be days, could be weeks. These men are careful and the territory is vast. But eventually they'll make a mistake. They always do. Gabriella nodded thoughtfully. I have crops that need tending. I cannot abandon them for weeks. And I have cattle to protect, Matthew added. Davies sighed. I expected as much. In that case, I suggest you stay together. 2 guns are better than 1, as I'm sure you discovered yesterday. He looked between them, his expression suggesting he was well aware of the gossip such an arrangement would generate. Propriety be damned when lives are at stake. Matthew watched Gabriella closely, uncertain how she would react to such a suggestion. Her face revealed nothing, but he noticed her hands had tightened on the arms of her chair. The sheriff is right, he said carefully. It would be safer for both of us to stay at one location. My ranch has better defensive positions, but your cabin is more secluded, less of a target. Gabriella was silent for a moment, weighing her options. Finally, she spoke. I will not abandon my home, she said firmly, but perhaps you could stay there with me until the danger has passed. There is the small shed room where you could sleep. The offer clearly cost her something to make, an acknowledgement of need that went against her fierce independence. Matthew nodded, understanding the significance of her decision. I'll need to arrange for someone to check on my cattle daily, he said, and bring supplies from my ranch. But yes, I think that's the wisest course. Sheriff Davies looked relieved. Good, I'll send a deputy to check on you both every couple of days, and if you see or hear anything suspicious, fire 3 shots in quick succession. It's our signal for trouble. Anyone hearing it is obliged to come running or to fetch help. With the arrangements made, Matthew and Gabriella left the sheriff's office to gather the supplies they would need. At the general store, they purchased extra ammunition, flour, coffee, and other essentials. Matthew then stopped at the livery stable to hire one of the stable boys, young Jamie Wilson, to ride out to his ranch daily to check on the herd. Keep an eye out for strangers, Matthew warned the boy. If you see anyone suspicious, don't approach. Ride straight back to town and tell the sheriff. Jamie nodded solemnly, clearly taking the responsibility seriously. I will, Mr. Anderson, you can count on me. Their last stop was the cafe, where they ate a quick lunch before beginning the journey back. Mrs. Porter predictably was full of questions about their early morning arrival in town together, but for once, Gabriella handled the woman's nosiness with remarkable calm. Yes, Mrs. Porter, Mr. Anderson and I encountered rustlers at his ranch yesterday evening, she explained between bites of stew. The sheriff has advised us to remain together for safety until the criminals are apprehended. Mrs. Porter's eyes widened. Together. Why, that's hardly proper, is it? A young woman alone with a man, even in such circumstances. Propriety seems a small concern when compared to being shot in the back by cattle thieves, Gabriella replied coolly. But I assure you the arrangement is entirely practical. Mr. Anderson will be sleeping in the shed room, which has its own entrance. The calm authority with which she delivered this information left Mrs. Porter momentarily speechless, a rare occurrence that Matthew savored silently. They left town shortly after noon, stopping briefly at Matthew's ranch to collect his clothes and some personal items, along with additional supplies for a potentially extended stay at Gabriella's cabin. By the time they arrived at her home, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills. I'll check the perimeter, Matthew said as they dismounted. Make sure no one's been here in our absence. Gabriella nodded, taking both horses to the corral while Matthew circled the property, rifle in hand. He found no sign of intruders. The garden was undisturbed, the cabin secure, the surrounding area quiet save for the normal sounds of wildlife. Inside, Gabriella had already begun preparing the shed room for his occupancy. The space was small, originally intended for storage, but she had cleared it and placed a narrow cot against one wall. "It's not much," she said, a hint of apology in her voice. "But it should be comfortable enough." "It's perfect," Matthew assured her. "I've slept in far worse conditions on cattle drives." As evening approached, they fell into a strange domesticity. Matthew chopping wood for the fire, Gabriella preparing supper, both of them moving around each other with an ease that belied the unusual circumstances of their arrangement. But beneath the routine tasks lay an undercurrent of tension, not just from the threat of the rustlers, but from the forced intimacy of their situation. After supper, they sat by the fire, the evening chill making the warmth welcome despite the season. Gabriella had taken up her sewing, working on another shirt for the tailor in town, while Matthew cleaned and oiled his revolver, a necessary task he would normally have performed alone. "Do you think they will come here?" Gabriella asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Matthew considered his answer carefully. "It's possible," he admitted, "but not likely, at least not immediately. They were after cattle, not people." "Your place has no herd to tempt them." "But as you said, they saw our faces," Gabriella persisted. "We can identify them." "True," Matthew acknowledged, "but they'd have to find us first, and your cabin isn't exactly on the main trail." "The sheriff knows where we are and his deputies will check regularly." He met her eyes across the fireplace. "We'll be vigilant, but try not to worry too much." Gabriella nodded, returning to her sewing. After a moment she spoke again, her voice softer. "I never thanked you properly for protecting me yesterday, for thinking of my safety first." "You hardly needed protection," Matthew replied with a smile. "You're the one who shot a rifle out of a rustler's hands." "Nevertheless," Gabriella insisted, it has been a very long time since anyone put my welfare before their own." She kept her eyes on her work as she continued. "Incent. Louis, after my father died, I learned quickly that most people's concern for a young woman alone is rarely genuine. There are always expectations, demands, a price to be paid." Matthew set his revolver aside, giving her his full attention. "Not with me, Gabriella, never with me." She looked up then, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. "I know," she said simply, "that is why I trust you. Why I can accept your help without fear." The admission touched Matthew deeply. Coming from Gabriella, with her history of betrayal and her hard-won independence, such trust was a precious gift. "I would never betray that trust," he promised quietly. Gabriella held his gaze for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, a softening, a decision being made. She set aside her sewing and rose from her chair, moving to sit beside him on the small sofa. "I know," she said again, and then with a courage that humbled him, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was a tentative kiss, gentle and questioning, but it took Matthew's breath away. He responded with equal gentleness, allowing her to set the pace, to determine the boundaries of this new territory they were entering together. When she drew back, her cheeks were flushed, but her eyes were clear and certain. "I have been afraid for so long," she said softly. "Afraid to trust, afraid to feel, afraid to want anything beyond mere survival. You have shown me that there can be more, even here on the frontier, even for someone like me." Matthew reached up to tuck a strand of wheat-blonde hair behind her ear, his touch as gentle as his voice. "There is nothing wrong with wanting more than survival, Gabriella, and there is nothing wrong with you. What happened in St. Louis, that was about the man who hurt you, not about any failing on your part." Tears welled in her eyes, though she blinked them back. "I have carried such shame," she whispered, "as if I had invited his attention, as if I deserved what happened." "You didn't," Matthew said firmly. "No one deserves to be used or betrayed. Especially not a young girl who had just lost her father." Gabriella nodded, accepting his words in a way she might not have months ago. "I know that now, in my mind at least. My heart is taking longer to believe it." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "But when I am with you, I can almost imagine a different kind of life, one where the past does not define everything." Matthew took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with her slender ones. "That life is possible, Gabriella. If you want it, if you're willing to risk reaching for it." She smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "I think perhaps I am," she said, "not all at once and not without fear. But step by step." They sat together in the firelight, hand in hand, the threat of rustlers momentarily forgotten in the wake of this more personal breakthrough. Later, Matthew would move to the shed room to sleep, respecting the boundaries they had established for propriety's sake. But something fundamental had shifted between them, a door opening to possibilities neither had dared to hope for just months ago. Outside, the moon rose over the Montana landscape, silvering the trees and casting long shadows across the garden Gabriella had planted with such care. In the distance, a wolf howled, the sound echoing against the hills, a reminder that the wilderness still held dangers, still demanded respect and vigilance. But inside the small cabin, two people who had learned to face the frontier alone had discovered something equally powerful. The strength that comes from facing it together. The next week passed in a strange, suspended state, the threat of the rustlers creating a constant undercurrent of tension, yet their enforced proximity bringing Matthew and Gabriella closer in ways neither had anticipated. They established a routine. Mornings spent tending the garden and checking the surrounding area for signs of intruders, afternoons occupied with necessary work, Gabriella with her sewing, Matthew repairing tools or chopping wood, evenings shared by the fire with books or conversation. Every other day, as promised, a deputy from town rode out to check on them, bringing news and mail. The rustlers had struck again, this time at the Peterson place 10 miles south, but had been driven off by a hastily organized group of neighboring ranchers. No one had been hurt, but the thieves had escaped, their identities still unknown. They're growing bolder, Deputy Miller reported during one visit. Sheriff thinks they might be part of a larger gang operating throughout the territory. He's expecting reinforcements from Helena any day now. The news was concerning, but life had to continue. Matthew rode to his ranch daily to check on the cattle and the young stable boy who was watching over them, always returning to Gabriella's cabin before nightfall. And each evening they grew a little more comfortable with each other, the walls Gabriella had built around her heart slowly lowering. On the 8th night of their arrangement, as they sat by the fire after supper, Gabriella broke a companionable silence with an unexpected question. "Do you ever think of leaving, starting over somewhere else?" Matthew looked up from the book he had been reading, considering her question. "I did after my parents died. The ranch felt too empty, the work too hard for one person. I thought about selling, using the money to go east, maybe find work in a city." "Why didn't you?" Gabriella asked, her sewing forgotten in her lap. "This land is in my blood," Matthew replied simply. "My father chose it, worked it, died for it in a way. Leaving felt like betraying everything he had built." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "Why do you ask? Are you thinking of leaving?" Gabriella shook her head. "No, this is the first place that has felt like mine, truly mine. I would not abandon it easily." She hesitated. "But I do wonder sometimes what might have been had my father lived. The life we might have had." "A different one certainly," Matthew acknowledged, "but not necessarily a better one." "No," Gabriella agreed softly, "not necessarily better." She rose and moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to look out at the moonlit yard. "I used to dream of going back east, to Boston or New York, somewhere with libraries and museums and concerts, somewhere civilized." She let the curtain fall back into place. "But now I wonder if I would feel as trapped there as I did in St. Louis, just in a different way." Matthew set his book aside and joined her at the window. "The frontier has its own kind of freedom," he said. "Harder earned perhaps, but no less real for that." "Yes," Gabriella agreed, turning to face him, "and its own kind of beauty." She reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with tentative gentleness. "I never expected to find that here, or this." Matthew caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Neither did I," he admitted. "I had resigned myself to solitude, convinced that the life I had chosen left no room for anything else." "And now?" Gabriella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I know better," Matthew said simply. "Now I want more." He leaned down and kissed her, no longer tentative as their first kiss had been, but still gentle, still allowing her to set the pace. Gabriella responded with growing confidence, her arms slipping around his neck as she pressed closer. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Gabriella looked up at him with an expression of wonder, as if surprised by her own response. "I never thought I could feel this way," she confessed. "After what happened in St. Louis, I believed that part of me was damaged. That I would never want a man's touch again." "You're not damaged, Gabriella," Matthew said firmly. "Changed by what happened, yes. Cautious because of it, understandably so, but not damaged." She smiled, a small but genuine expression. "Perhaps you're right, perhaps it was just a matter of finding someone worthy of trust." Her smile faded slightly. "But I am still afraid, Matthew, not of you but of disappointing you. Of not being able to be what you might want." Matthew shook his head. All I want is you, Gabriella. As you are, however you are, there is no expectation, no demand. We can take this as slowly as you need. Relief softened her features. Thank you, she said simply, for understanding, for being patient. Always, Matthew promised. They returned to the fire, sitting closer now, Gabriella leaning slightly against his shoulder as they resumed their quiet evening activities. Outside, the night was still, the only sounds the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was the calm before the storm, though neither of them knew it yet. The next morning dawned gray and cool, a rare summer storm building on the horizon. Matthew rose early as usual, moving quietly to avoid waking Gabriella as he slipped out to check the property. The air felt heavy, charged with the electricity of the approaching weather. As he walked the perimeter, rifle in hand, he noted fresh deer tracks near the garden fence but no sign of human intruders. Gabriella was up and preparing breakfast by the time he returned, her hair braided simply down her back, her manner easy and unself-conscious in a way it had not been when they first began this arrangement. Storm's coming, she observed, glancing at the window where raindrops had begun to spatter against the glass. A good day to stay indoors. Matthew nodded, hanging his hat by the door. I should still ride to check on the ranch, but I'll make it quick, back before the worst hits. Gabriella frowned slightly but did not object. She had come to understand his sense of responsibility toward the ranch his father had built, just as he respected her devotion to her garden and home. They ate breakfast together, discussing plans for the day. Gabriella intended to can the first of her vegetable harvest, preparing for the winter ahead. Matthew promised to help when he returned from checking his cattle. Be careful, she said as he prepared to leave, the rain now falling steadily outside. The creek rises quickly in storms like this. I will, Matthew assured her, touched by her concern. Lock the door behind me and keep your rifle close, just as a precaution. Gabriella nodded, following him to the door. Before he could step outside, she caught his arm, turning him back to face her. Matthew, she said softly. Last night, I want you to know that she hesitated, then continued with quiet determination. I love you. I should have said it then, but I was afraid. I'm not afraid now. The words, so unexpected and so precious, struck Matthew like a physical force. He had hoped, of course, but hearing her say it, seeing the certainty in her eyes, was beyond anything he had imagined. Gabriella, he breathed, pulling her into his arms, I love you too. More than I can say. Their kiss was tender yet urgent, a declaration and a promise wrapped together. When they parted, Gabriella smiled up at him, no longer guarded, no longer afraid. Go, she said, check your ranch. But come back to me. Always, Matthew promised, nothing could keep me away. The rain was falling harder as he rode out, thunder picking his way carefully along the muddy trail. The storm had intensified, thunder rumbling in the distance, lightning occasionally illuminating the cloud-darkened landscape. Matthew pulled his hat lower against the downpour, mentally calculating the fastest route to his ranch and back. He had just crossed the creek, swollen but still passable, when he heard it, a gunshot distant but distinct coming from the direction of his ranch. Then another and a third, the signal for trouble. Matthew urged thunder forward, caution giving way to urgency. As he crested the rise that overlooked his property, he pulled up short, horror gripping his chest. Smoke rose from his barn despite the rain, flames visible through the open doors. Several of his cattle lay motionless in the nearby corral, while others had scattered across the pasture. And in the yard between the barn and the cabin, a body sprawled face down in the mud. Jamie, the stable boy, cold fury replaced horror. Matthew urged thunder down the slope, approaching cautiously, aware that whoever had done this might still be present. The yard appeared deserted, but he took no chances, dismounting behind a stand of trees and approaching on foot, rifle ready. The boy was dead, shot in the back as he had apparently tried to run for help. He couldn't have been more than 14, his young face forever frozen in an expression of terror. Matthew's hands shook with rage as he gently closed the boy's eyes. The barn was beyond saving, the fire having taken hold despite the rain. Matthew's cabin had been ransacked, furniture overturned, his parents' few precious possessions scattered or stolen. But it was the deliberate cruelty of the boy's murder that told him this was more than simple theft. This was revenge, the rustlers sending a message to those who had dared to resist them, and if they had come here, they might also go to Gabriella's. The thought galvanized Matthew into action. He quickly checked the surrounding area, finding hoofprints leading east, away from town, but also away from Gabriella's cabin. Still, he could not take chances. He needed to warn the sheriff, then get back to Gabriella as quickly as possible. He mounted Thunder, pushing the tired horse harder than he liked, racing toward town through the worsening storm. The creek had risen further, forcing them to find a shallower crossing upstream, costing precious minutes. By the time they reached Whitefish Creek, both horse and rider were exhausted, mud-splattered and soaked to the skin. Sheriff Davies was out on patrol, the deputy informed him, but riders had been sent to track him down with news of the attack on Matthew's ranch. "They found the boy?" Matthew asked grimly. The deputy nodded, his young face pale. "Brought him in an hour ago. Sheriff organized a posse immediately, but with the storm." He gestured helplessly at the rain still pounding the roof. "I need fresh horses," Matthew said, "and men if you can spare them. I left someone alone who may be in danger." "Miss O'Connor?" the deputy asked, understanding immediately. Sheriff already sent 2 men to check on her. They should have reached her place by now. Relief flooded Matthew, but it was short-lived. "I need to go to her," he insisted, "now." The deputy hesitated, then nodded. "Take my horse, he's fresh. I'll follow with reinforcements as soon as the sheriff returns." Matthew wasted no time, transferring his saddle to the deputy's sturdy bay and setting out again into the storm. The rain had lessened somewhat, but the creek would be higher now, perhaps impassable at the usual crossing. He would have to take the longer route, skirting the high ground to reach Gabriella's cabin. The journey seemed endless, each minute stretching like an hour as he pushed the bay to its limits. When finally the cabin came into view, Matthew felt a momentary surge of hope. It stood intact, smoke rising from the chimney, no sign of violence or disturbance. But where were the men the sheriff had sent? Matthew approached cautiously, rifle ready, scanning the area for any movement. He dismounted some distance away, leading the horse quietly through the trees that bordered Gabriella's property. The yard was empty, the garden undisturbed. No horses were visible in the corral, which struck Matthew as odd. The deputies would have left their mounts there. The cabin door was closed, the windows shuttered against the storm. Something wasn't right. Matthew secured the bay to a tree and moved forward silently, years of hunting having taught him how to move without detection. As he approached the cabin, he caught a flicker of movement at the corner of his eye, a shadow by the woodpile partially concealed. One of the deputies, he thought at first, then realized the man was bound, a gag in his mouth, blood matting his hair where he had clearly been struck. Their eyes met, and the deputy made a frantic motion with his head toward the cabin door. Matthew's blood ran cold. If one deputy was here, bound and injured, where was the other? And more importantly, where was Gabriella? He crept closer to the cabin, staying low, using the garden fence as cover. As he neared the window, he heard voices from within, male voices, rough and angry, and beneath them, a woman's voice, steady but strained. Gabriella. Matthew eased up enough to peer through a crack in the shutters. What he saw made his heart hammer against his ribs. Gabriella stood with her back to the fireplace, her posture rigid but defiant. Before her stood 3 men, the rustlers undoubtedly. One held a revolver pointed casually in her direction, while another rummaged through her possessions. The third, a tall man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, seemed to be questioning her. "Tell you again, where is he?" the scarred man was saying, his tone suggesting it wasn't the first time he had asked. "And I have told you," Gabriella replied, her voice remarkably steady, "I do not know. He left this morning to check his ranch. He could be anywhere by now." The scarred man stepped closer to her, his posture menacing. "You're lying, girl. The Anderson place is burning. He'd have seen it, come running back to warn you." "Unless he went to town instead," Gabriella countered. "To alert the sheriff." The man with the gun laughed. "She's got you there, Jade. Maybe the cowboy ain't as stupid as you thought." The scarred man, Jade, shot his companion an irritated look. "Shut up, Carson." He turned back to Gabriella. "If he went to town, that's even worse for us. Means we've got less time." The third man looked up from his ransacking of Gabriella's trunk. "Nothing here worth taking, Jade. Just clothes and books." "We're not here for valuables, you idiot," Jade snapped. "We're here for Anderson. Him and this woman are the only ones who can identify us to the law." He moved closer to Gabriella. "And since he's not here, we'll just have to make do with leaving him a message he won't forget." Matthew had heard enough. 3 against 1 were bad odds, but he had surprise on his side. And more importantly, he had Gabriella's life to protect. He moved to the door, counting on the storm to mask his approach. Taking a deep breath, he kicked it open, rifle raised. "Drop your weapons," he shouted. "No." The 3 men reacted with varying speed. The one called Carson swung his revolver toward Matthew, who fired first. Carson dropped with a cry, clutching his shoulder. The man who had been searching Gabriella's belongings dove for cover, drawing his own weapon. Jade, the scarred leader, lunged for Gabriella, grabbing her and using her as a shield, his knife at her throat. "Drop the rifle, Anderson," he snarled, "or she dies right now." Matthew froze, the rifle still aimed but now useless with Gabriella in the line of fire. Her eyes met his, wide but determined, not showing the fear she must surely feel. "Do as he says, Matthew," she said calmly. "Please." Slowly, reluctantly, Matthew lowered the rifle to the floor, raising his hands to show they were empty. "That's better," Jade said with a cruel smile. "Now we can talk like civilized men." "Let her go," Matthew said, his voice hard. "Your quarrel is with me, not her." Jade laughed. "My quarrel is with anyone who can identify me to a marshal, Anderson. That includes both of you." He tightened his grip on Gabriella, the knife pressing harder against her skin. "You cost me a good score at your ranch, and now you've shot poor Carson here. I'd say that makes us overdue for a reckoning." The third rustler had emerged from cover, his gun now trained on Matthew. "Kill them both, Jade," he urged. "We need to get out of here before the law shows up." "Oh, we'll kill them," Jade agreed. "But not before Anderson here understands exactly what happens to people who cross me." His meaning was clear, and it sent a chill through Matthew's soul. He had to act now before these men could harm Gabriella in the ways they were clearly contemplating. "You're making a mistake," Matthew said, playing for time as he assessed his options. "The sheriff already knows who you are." "Killing us won't change that." "Maybe not," Jade conceded, "but it'll sure make me feel better." He began dragging Gabriella toward the bedroom. "Jenkins, keep your gun on Anderson." "Shoot him if he moves." Jenkins, the third rustler, nodded, his revolver steady as he covered Matthew. "Don't try nothing, Cowboy. I'd be happy to put a bullet in you right now." Matthew's mind raced. He had his revolver still holstered beneath his coat, but drawing it would be suicide with Jenkins watching him so closely. He needed a distraction, something to divert the man's attention for just a moment. Across the room, Gabriella caught his eye. She gave an almost imperceptible nod, then suddenly went limp in Jade's grasp as if fainting. The sudden deadweight caught Jade by surprise. He staggered, momentarily loosening his grip on the knife at her throat. In that instant, Gabriella drove her elbow hard into his stomach, then twisted away as he doubled over. Jenkins turned instinctively toward the commotion, his attention diverted just long enough for Matthew to draw his revolver and fire. The bullet struck Jenkins in the arm, causing him to drop his weapon with a howl of pain. Gabriella had seized a kettle from the stove, bringing it down hard on Jade's head as he tried to regain his balance. The rustler stumbled but did not fall, turning toward her with murderous rage in his eyes. Matthew launched himself across the room, tackling Jade before he could reach Gabriella again. They crashed into the table, sending it toppling as they grappled for control of the knife Jade still clutched. Gabriella retrieved Jenkins's fallen revolver, backing away from the wounded man who was trying to stem the bleeding from his arm. Carson remained on the floor where he had fallen, apparently unconscious from blood loss. The fight between Matthew and Jade was brutal and desperate. Jade was heavier, stronger, his face contorted with a hatred that seemed to fuel his strength. But Matthew fought with the courage of a man defending not just his own life, but that of the woman he loved. They rolled across the floor, each seeking leverage, each trying to gain control of the knife. Jade landed a blow to Matthew's jaw that sent stars exploding across his vision. Matthew responded with a knee to the rustler's midsection, forcing the air from his lungs. Suddenly Jade found an opening, the knife slashing downward toward Matthew's throat. Matthew caught his wrist at the last moment, the blade hovering inches from his skin as they struggled for dominance. "I'm going to kill you, Anderson," Jade panted, his face red with exertion. "And then I'm going to take my time with your woman before I kill her too." The words ignited a fury in Matthew that transcended pain and exhaustion. With a roar of rage, he twisted Jade's arm, forcing the knife away and then back toward the rustler. For an instant, they were locked in stalemate, neither able to gain the final advantage. Then a gunshot rang out, deafening in the confined space of the cabin. Jade's eyes widened in shock. He looked down to see blood spreading across his chest, then up to where Gabriella stood, Jenkins's revolver smoking in her steady hands. "You," Jade gasped, then collapsed, the knife clattering to the floor beside him. Matthew scrambled away from the fallen rustler, retrieving his own revolver and checking that the other two men were still incapacitated. Carson remained unconscious, while Jenkins had wisely frozen in place when he saw his leader fall. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked Gabriella urgently, scanning her for injuries. She nodded, the revolver still held firmly in her grasp. "Yes, you." "I'm fine," he assured her, though his jaw ached where Jade had struck him. "There's a deputy tied up outside. We need to free him and secure these two before they recover enough to cause more trouble." Together they bound the surviving rustlers with rope from Gabriella's supplies, then went outside to free the captured deputy. He was dazed but conscious, explaining that his partner had been shot outright when they arrived to check on Gabriella. "They came out of nowhere," the deputy said shakily as Matthew helped him into the cabin. "Professional ambush. Never even had a chance to draw." "And the other deputy?" Matthew asked grimly. "Dead," the man confirmed. "Shot him right in front of me, then used me to get inside. Said they'd kill me too if Miss O'Connor didn't cooperate." Gabriella, who had been heating water for coffee, paused at this. "I'm sorry about your partner," she said quietly. "He seemed like a good man." The deputy nodded, accepting the coffee she offered. He had a wife and baby in town. His expression hardened as he looked at the bound rustlers. "At least we got them, that's something." They spent the next hour tending to the deputy's wounds and keeping watch over their prisoners. Jenkins eventually regained enough composure to speak, offering information in exchange for leniency. "There's more of us," he admitted, "part of Blackwood's gang out of Wyoming. Jade was just leading our splinter group up here looking for easy pickings." Matthew and the deputy exchanged looks. Blackwood was a notorious outlaw whose gang had been terrorizing ranchers across 3 territories. "How many more?" the deputy demanded. "In this area, just us 3 now," Jenkins said. "But Blackwood's got at least 20 men in his main group. They operate south mostly. Wouldn't come this far north unless there was serious money involved." The information was disturbing, but also reassuring in a way. If these 3 were indeed a splinter group, their capture might end the immediate threat to the area. As the storm finally began to clear, they heard the approach of horses, the reinforcements the deputy in town had promised. Sheriff Davies himself led the group, his expression grim as he took in the scene inside the cabin. 3 casualties, he noted, checking Jade's body, and 2 prisoners. Not bad work, Anderson. "Miss O'Connor," he nodded respectfully to Gabriella, "though I'm sorry it came to this." "So am I," Gabriella said softly, her composure finally beginning to crack now that the immediate danger had passed. Matthew moved to her side, placing a supportive arm around her shoulders. "We'll take these men to town," Davies said, gesturing for his deputies to secure the prisoners and the bodies. "There'll be inquests, of course, but given the circumstances, I don't foresee any difficulties. Clearly self-defense." Matthews nodded, grateful for the sheriff's matter-of-fact handling of the situation. "What about my ranch?" "The boy, Jamie's been taken care of," Davies assured him. "His family's been notified. And I've already sent men to secure your property and check the damage. The barn's a loss, but the house is salvageable. Some of your cattle scattered, but most seem to have stayed put." It was both better and worse than Matthew had feared. The loss of the barn was significant but not catastrophic. Buildings could be rebuilt, but Jamie's death, that was a wound that would not heal so easily. As the law enforcement party prepared to leave with their prisoners and the dead, Sheriff Davies pulled Matthew aside. "You should both come to town," he said quietly. "At least for tonight. This place is a mess and you both look like you could use some rest somewhere, less complicated." Matthew glanced at Gabriella, who was straightening what furniture remained intact, her movements mechanical, as if she were operating on instinct rather than conscious thought. "We'll come," he agreed. "She shouldn't stay here tonight with—" He gestured at the bloodstains on the floor, the overturned furniture, the general chaos of violence that had transformed her sanctuary into a scene of horror. Davies nodded understanding. "I'll have my men help you gather what you need." An hour later, they rode into Whitefish Creek as part of the somber procession. Word had spread quickly, and townspeople lined the street, watching in silence as the prisoners were taken to the jail and the bodies to the undertakers. Mrs. Porter, showing a sensitivity few would have credited her with, had prepared rooms for both Matthew and Gabriella above the cafe. She ushered them upstairs with minimal fuss, promising hot food and privacy. "You poor dears," she said, her usual nosiness subsumed by genuine concern. "What a terrible ordeal. You just rest now. Everything else can wait until morning. Left alone in the small sitting room that connected their separate bedrooms, Matthew and Gabriella faced each other in the gathering dusk. They had barely spoken since the reinforcements arrived, both too caught up in the necessities of the moment to process what had happened or what it meant for them. "Are you truly all right?" Matthew asked, reaching for her hands. "You're not injured." Gabriella shook her head, allowing him to take her hands in his. "No, not physically at least." She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him, her green eyes shadowed. "I killed a man today, Matthew." "To save my life," Matthew reminded her gently, "and your own, there was no choice." "I know," she whispered, "and I would do it again. That's what frightens me, I think, how certain I was in that moment, how clear everything became." Matthew understood. He had faced similar moments in his life on the frontier, instances where violence became necessary, where the line between living and dying was drawn by one's willingness to act decisively. "The frontier demands hard choices sometimes," he said, "but making them doesn't change who you are, Gabriella, not at the core." She nodded slowly, accepting his words if not entirely believing them yet. "When they came," she said, her voice stronger now, "my first thought was for you, not for myself but for you, that you might ride into their trap, that I might lose you before," she faltered. "Before what?" Matthew prompted gently. Gabriella met his eyes directly. "Before we had a chance to build something together, a life, a future." She took a shaky breath. "I realized then how much I want that, Matthew, how much I want you. Not just as a visitor to my cabin, not just as a friend or even a lover someday, but as my partner. My husband, if you'll have me." The words, so unexpected and yet so perfectly right, took Matthew's breath away. This strong, independent woman who had fled to the wilderness to escape men's control was now offering him the most precious gift imaginable, her trust, her future, herself. "Gabriella," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "nothing would make me happier than to be your husband, to build a life with you wherever and however you want it to be." Her smile, tentative at first, bloomed into radiance. "I love you, Matthew Anderson. I never thought I would say those words to any man, but I love you with all my heart." "And I love you, Gabriella O'Connor," Matthew replied, drawing her into his arms. "More than I can possibly express." Their kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise and a beginning all at once. When they finally parted, both were smiling despite the trauma of the day, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "We should rest," Matthew said reluctantly. "Tomorrow will bring questions, arrangements, decisions." Gabriella nodded, stepping back but keeping hold of his hand. "Yes. But we'll face them together." She squeezed his fingers, then released them. "Good night, Matthew, sleep well." "Good night, Gabriella," he replied, watching as she entered her bedroom and closed the door softly behind her. Alone in the sitting room, Matthew looked out the window at the town below, now quiet in the gathering darkness. The day had brought violence and loss, but also clarity and improbably joy. Tomorrow would indeed bring questions, about his ranch, about Gabriella's cabin, about where and how they would make their life together. But whatever came, they would no longer face it alone. And that, Matthew thought as he finally sought his own rest, made all the difference in the world. Epilogue. Montana Territory, 1875, 5 years later. The autumn afternoon was golden, the cottonwoods along the creek ablaze with color as the October sun dipped toward the western mountains. Matthew Anderson stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the scene before him with quiet contentment. In the yard, Gabriella was helping their 4-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, collect fallen leaves for pressing between the pages of books. The child's laughter rang out as she chased a particularly vivid red leaf blown by the breeze, her wheat blonde hair, so like her mother's, catching the sunlight. Nearby, in a wooden cradle Matthew had crafted himself, their 6-month-old son Thomas slept peacefully, bundled against the autumn chill. Occasionally, Gabriella would pause in her play with Elizabeth to check on the baby, her movements natural and unself-conscious. Her smile radiant in a way that still took Matthew's breath away, even after 5 years of marriage. So much had changed since that violent day when rustlers had threatened to destroy everything they held dear. The weeks that followed had been a time of healing and decision-making. Matthew's ranch had needed extensive repairs, while Gabriella's cabin had held too many painful memories to return to immediately. In the end, they had chosen to rebuild on Matthew's land, where the infrastructure for ranching already existed. They had married that winter in a small ceremony at the church in Whitefish Creek, with Sheriff Davies giving the bride away and Mrs. Porter weeping openly in the front pew. The new house they built was larger than either of their previous homes, with proper bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Inside, Gabriella's books shared shelves with Matthew's, her herbs hung from the kitchen rafters beside cooking pots that had belonged to his mother, their separate lives blending into a shared whole. They had kept Gabriella's cabin too, using it as a hunting lodge and occasional retreat. The garden she had planted with such care still thrived, now expanded to feed their growing family and provide extra produce to sell in town. Nothing was wasted, nothing forgotten of the lives they had lived before finding each other. The ranch itself had prospered under their joint stewardship. Matthew's cattle herd had grown, while Gabriella had added sheep, whose wool she processed herself for spinning and weaving during the winter months. What had once been a modest operation was now one of the most successful spreads in the county, a testament to their combined determination and hard work. But it was the less tangible changes that Matthew valued most. Gabriella, once so guarded and isolated, had blossomed in the security of their partnership. She still maintained her independence, still spoke her mind with the same forthrightness that had first intrigued him, but the brittle defenses that had once surrounded her heart had melted away. She had found her place in the community, respected for her intelligence and skills rather than defined by her marriage or her past. And Matthew, who had once believed the frontier was no place for connections, had discovered the strength that comes from sharing burdens rather than bearing them alone. His father's legacy no longer felt like a weight he had to carry by himself, but a foundation upon which he and Gabriella were building something new and enduring. Elizabeth came running to the porch, her small hands clutching a collection of leaves in every shade of autumn. "Papa, look, Mama says we can make pictures with these. Will you help?" Matthew smiled, kneeling to examine his daughter's treasures. "These are beautiful, Lizzie, and yes, I'd be happy to help." Gabriella joined them, the baby now awake and content in her arms. "I thought we could press some for those frames you made," she suggested, her green eyes warm as she looked at her husband. "A reminder of this autumn to keep through the winter." "A perfect idea," Matthew agreed, rising to kiss her softly. "Though I hardly need reminders to be grateful for what we have." Gabriella smiled, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. "Nor I," she said simply, "but it's good to mark the seasons, to remember how far we've come." From the lonely cabin in the wilderness to this thriving ranch, from strangers meeting in a blizzard to partners in every sense of the word, it had been a journey neither could have imagined that stormy night 5 years ago. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the four of them went inside together, closing the door against the gathering chill. The lamp Gabriella lit cast a warm glow,